All right, so you really want to get a handle on what went down, right?
Yeah.
Cut through all the noise and figure out what actually matters.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're doing here.
We've gone through this whole mountain of stuff: news articles, legal battles, policy papers, even that, what was it called?
The generated book.pdf.
Right, that thing. All to give you the key insights nice and efficiently.
Our focus today is on that initial period of President Trump's second term, beginning January 20th, 2025.
Think of it as your express lane to understanding a pivotal moment. We're talking executive orders, personnel choices. I mean, Elon Musk even pops up major shifts in immigration policy, the whole Social Security controversy, and, yeah, the immediate legal pushback that all kicked off. Buckle up. It's going to be a ride.
It all starts on January 20th, 2025.
Yeah.
Day one. And what really jumps out is the sheer volume of executive orders. 26 in a single day.
Whoa, 26?
Yeah.
That's got to be some kind of record, right?
It's certainly unprecedented in recent history.
Just a quick refresher for everyone. An executive order is basically a presidential directive that has the force of law.
Right. It's a way for the president to manage federal operations and put existing laws into action.
So using executive orders is normal, but 26 on the first day? That's got to raise some eyebrows.
It certainly signaled an intention to govern very actively, potentially leading to a more centralized executive branch.
And what about the relationship with Congress? I mean, if you're using executive orders this much, what does that say about working with them?
Well, if we think about the core principles of U.S. governance, this approach definitely raises questions about the balance of power.
Right. The Constitution has that whole checks and balances thing, with Congress being the main lawmaking body.
Exactly. And relying heavily on executive orders for big policy changes could be seen as sidestepping that legislative process.
Basically concentrating power in the executive branch and maybe moving away from that ideal of laws being made through debate and compromise.
Precisely.
And speaking of impactful moves, that was also the day Elon Musk got appointed to lead the brand new Department of Government Efficiency.
Right. A really attention-grabbing move.
Now, he was given a lot of power. Reorganizing agencies, even firing people.
The administration framed it as bringing private sector efficiency to the government.
But, I mean, you've got this tech giant with zero government experience suddenly reshaping the federal bureaucracy.
It definitely raised some eyebrows. Some argued that Musk, with his background in managing huge, complex organizations and his tech focus, could shake things up for the better. But others were very worried about his lack of public sector experience, the impact on longtime civil servants, and whether this was the right approach for government.
So big questions about stability and expertise versus this idea of disruption and innovation.
Exactly.
Then, just 2 days in, on January 22nd, there's this big focus on immigration. 2 major actions at the southern border.
First, President Trump reinstates the national emergency declaration about the border.
Which, if we remember his first term, this was the move used to redirect funds to that border wall, right?
Exactly. This time, around $4 billion got shifted from military construction and another $600 million from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund.
And the administration's reasoning was?
Pretty similar to before. They talked about high levels of unauthorized crossings, drug trafficking, and criminal activity. Basically, the argument was this justified the emergency declaration and reallocating those funds.
But I'm guessing critics weren't buying it.
Many argued it was a way to bypass Congress and get around their control over spending.
Which brings us back to that debate about the limits of presidential power.
Right. It also raised ethical questions about whether that money could have been better used for things like healthcare or education.
Okay, then the second big immigration move on the 22nd was that asylum ban.
This was a huge deal. The executive order basically shut down the ability of most asylum seekers at the southern border to even apply for protection.
And that's where things got really controversial, right?
Immediately. International law, including the UN Refugee Convention, recognizes the right to seek asylum. Legal challenges popped up right away, saying this ban violated those international agreements and basic human rights.
So this wasn't just a policy debate. It was a legal and moral one.
Exactly. And the courts got involved fast.
They did. A case was filed almost immediately in federal court, showing how divisive this policy was. It really highlighted that role of the judiciary in checking executive actions that might be unconstitutional.
The impact on people fleeing danger was potentially huge. It challenged this long-standing tradition of the U.S. being a safe haven.
Okay, so moving on to the next day, January 23rd. Another significant action, still at the border. Mexican drug cartels designated as terrorist organizations.
Right. This gave the U.S. government more authority, particularly for domestic surveillance.
So what was the controversy here?
The main concern was about executive power going too far,
Bypassing Congress again.
essentially. Critics questioned if this should have been a decision for Congress, especially since it had potential military implications.
Even if no military action was directly authorized, it kind of opened the door.
Right, exactly. And the Mexican government was not happy. They were worried about the impact on U.S.-Mexico relations and their own efforts to fight drug trafficking.
So a lot of tension around this move. Then on January 24th, things shifted to the federal workforce.
This was a big one. An executive order authorized firing over 20,000 federal employees.
Wow, 20,000. That's a massive number.
And it was overseen by Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency.
Okay, so now Musk's directly involved in reshaping the government workforce.
The official reason was to make things more efficient and deal with perceived disloyalty within the civil service.
Disloyalty, that's a pretty loaded term.
It was. Critics were worried about the lack of transparency and due process in these firings. There were no clear criteria for disloyalty or inefficiency.
So it looked like potential political targeting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There were concerns about executive overreach, long-term damage to government agencies, and, of course, Musk's outsized role in all this.
Right. That private sector influence on public service was a recurring theme. Then, on January 25th, there's this new directive about how public health information gets communicated.
This was about centralizing control over what agencies like the CDC and FDA could say publicly,
So basically, putting a filter on their communications.
which immediately raised concerns about politicizing health information. The worry was that decisions about what to share wouldn't be based on science, but on politics.
That's a recipe for distrust. I mean, the credibility of those agencies relies on them being seen as independent and transparent.
Absolutely. Restricting their communication could damage public trust, and it could even have consequences internationally because those agencies collaborate globally on health issues.
Right. If they can't communicate freely, that affects global health security. Okay, so we've seen all these rapid-fire actions, and it didn't take long for the legal pushback to begin. By January 26th, the lawsuits were rolling in.
Civil rights groups like the ACLU and the NAACP filed suits challenging both the asylum ban and those mass firings.
So targeting two of the most controversial moves right out of the gate.
They argued that these actions violated the First Amendment regarding the rights of asylum seekers and the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees due process for those fired employees.
Basically saying, hold on, this isn't how our system is supposed to work.
It was a clear attempt to challenge the constitutionality of these executive orders and push back against what they saw as an erosion of basic rights.
And they were especially worried about the impact on vulnerable communities.
Exactly, those who are often most affected by these kinds of policies.
All right, so we've covered a really intense first week, but things didn't calm down after that. In fact, the sources suggest a further escalation in the following weeks. Some even described it as a slide towards more authoritarian tactics. Let's start with January 30th.
On that day, President Trump suggests that Congress should be able to override judicial review.
Wow, override judicial review. Meaning what exactly?
Basically, being able to overturn decisions made by the Supreme Court or other federal courts.
So if the courts say something is unconstitutional, Congress could just say, nope, we're doing it anyway.
That was the idea. Now, supporters might argue it would make the government more responsive to the will of the people as expressed through their elected representatives.
Right, the argument that the courts are sometimes too powerful, out of touch with what people want.
But on the other hand, critics warned that this would completely upend the balance of power.
It's that whole checks and balances thing again, right?
Exactly. The judiciary's role is to make sure the other branches are playing by the rules, following the Constitution. Weakening that could lead to almost unlimited executive power.
And it fits into this broader trend we're seeing globally, where some leaders try to limit the power of the courts.
It's a very worrying development for anyone who believes in democratic institutions.
Then on February 1st, the administration goes even further and seems to directly defy a court order.
The reports are that, despite a federal court injunction temporarily blocking the asylum ban, they kept deporting asylum seekers.
So a court says stop, and they just ignore it.
That's what it looks like. And that kind of defiance of a court order is incredibly serious. It undermines the whole idea of the rule of law and the separation of powers.
If the executive branch can just ignore the courts, what's to stop them from doing whatever they want?
It sets a dangerous precedent. It also raises huge questions about the administration's commitment to operating within the law and respecting the rights of vulnerable people.
Right, those seeking asylum are already in a precarious position. Then, on February 2nd, we see those restrictions on protesting.
An executive order came down that really limited permits for protests near federal buildings in D.C.
5-mile radius, right?
Yeah. And this happened right after those big protests against some of the administration's actions. So it definitely looked like they were trying to stifle dissent.
Basically saying, we don't want to hear your complaints.
Legal challenges were filed almost immediately, arguing this violated the First Amendment right to free speech and assembly.
So it became a battle over where the line is between security and the right to protest.
A classic dilemma in democracies. But in this case, the timing and the broad scope of the restrictions were very concerning.
Okay, then February 3rd brings the shutdown of those whistleblower hotlines.
This was done by Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. And those hotlines are vital for government accountability. They let employees report waste, fraud, abuse anything that's wrong without fear of getting punished.
So shutting them down sends a pretty clear message.
It does. It tells employees to stay silent, which could lead to all sorts of problems. Without those hotlines, how does misconduct get exposed?
Right, it creates an environment where corruption can flourish.
Mhm.
Then, just one day later, on February 4th, it becomes even harder for the public to find out what the government's up to.
They put a hold on all Freedom of Information Act requests for 60 days.
FOIA requests. Remind us what those are.
It's the law that lets anyone, journalists, researchers, regular people, request information from the government. It's a cornerstone of transparency and accountability.
So suspending those requests basically blocks public access to information about what the government's doing.
It raised serious concerns about whether the administration was trying to hide something.
Or at least control the narrative.
Right. It makes it much harder to scrutinize their actions.
Okay, then, on February 5th, we see action taken against people who've been critical of the administration.
President Trump revoked the security clearances of over 50 former officials who had spoken out against him.
So people who had access to classified information because of their past government roles suddenly lost that access.
And it was widely seen as a way to punish them for their dissent. It also raised concerns about whether this was meant to discourage others from speaking out.
If you criticize the president, you lose your clearance and your platform. Not exactly a healthy message for free speech.
Especially when it comes to matters of national security where diverse viewpoints are crucial.
Okay, then on February 6th, we get to the introduction of some pretty powerful and controversial technology.
This was the day Elon Musk's department implemented that AI-powered surveillance system to monitor what federal employees were doing online.
Monitoring their emails, their internet browsing, all that.
Essentially, and that raised huge concerns about privacy rights, especially under the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches.
Right. Do government employees give up all privacy just because they work for the government?
That's a big question. There was also the concern about this being used to target people based on their political views.
So if you like a certain website or post something critical of the administration, you could be flagged.
That was the worry. And it could create a chilling effect where people are afraid to express themselves for fear of being monitored.
Right. Self-censorship out of fear. And this is all happening in the context of those mass firings and the general atmosphere of distrust.
Exactly. It all adds up to a very troubling picture.
Then, on February 7th, there's a move that directly impacts diversity and inclusion efforts.
This was the executive order that ended all those federal diversity training programs.
The ones designed to promote equality and address issues like discrimination in the workplace.
The administration called them divisive and un-American.
That sparked quite a debate, didn't it?
It did. Critics argued that these programs are crucial for creating a fairer and more inclusive workplace. They said this move was a step backward.
But supporters of the order argue that these programs were actually causing more division than they were solving.
So a very contentious issue. Then, by February 8th, we see the real-world consequences of all this for federal workers.
What happened?
The Civil Liberties Watchdog Group reported a huge spike in retaliation claims from federal employees. This was after the surveillance started and those mass firings took place.
So people were speaking out less and feeling more afraid of punishment.
Exactly. It points to a potential pattern of abuse and a chilling effect on dissent.
Okay, so things are already pretty tense and chaotic. Then, around February 19th, the focus shifts to financial matters, specifically a crisis brewing around Social Security.
That's when those accusations came out that Elon Musk and his department accessed the Social Security Administration's database without authorization.
Whoa, the database with everyone's Social Security numbers and personal information.
That's the one. It immediately raised huge privacy concerns and questions about whether data had been misused.
I bet that triggered some serious investigations.
It did. Then, the next day, on February 20th, things got even worse.
How so?
Whistleblowers came forward claiming that DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, was using Social Security numbers illegally.
Mining them, as some reports put it.
It was a major scandal, potentially involving identity theft and fraud on a massive scale.
So we've got privacy violations, potential criminal activity, and all this connected to Elon Musk and his department.
Right in the heart of the government. Then, on February 21st, the administration takes this really drastic step with Social Security funds.
What did they do?
They issued an executive order to redirect Social Security money into private accounts.
Private accounts managed by...
From firms that had links to Elon Musk.
Wow, that's a huge conflict of interest, isn't it?
It certainly raised a lot of red flags, and people were understandably worried about the security of their retirement savings.
I mean, Social Security is supposed to be this rock-solid guarantee for millions of Americans.
It is. And this move created a lot of uncertainty and fear about the future of the program.
So naturally, people fought back.
They did. Civil rights groups filed lawsuits on February 22nd, arguing that this move was reckless and jeopardized the well-being of millions. They said it was a violation of the government's responsibility to protect its citizens.
And they were highlighting the fact that Social Security isn't just about money, it's about basic rights.
It's a safety net, especially for the most vulnerable. Then, on February 23rd, there are reports that the government tried to control the narrative around all this.
How so?
The Office of Information Control reportedly suppressed news coverage about problems with Social Security payments.
So they were trying to hide the fact that things were going wrong.
It looks like it.
Yeah.
But this raises serious concerns about censorship and the government trying to keep the public in the dark.
Especially when people are relying on those payments and need to know what's happening.
Exactly. Transparency is crucial in these situations.
Okay, then the controversy ramps up even further on February 24th when Elon Musk refuses to cooperate with a congressional investigation.
Congress wanted him to testify about the data breaches and the alleged misuse of Social Security numbers.
And his response was?
He said no, claiming executive privilege.
So he's refusing to answer to Congress.
Which obviously fueled public anger. It also raised questions about accountability and whether Musk was really above the law.
Right. Even if he's working in the government now, he's still a private citizen with a lot of power and potentially a lot to hide.
And his actions were directly affecting the lives of millions.
Then, on February 25th, things reach a breaking point when President Trump declares a financial emergency.
And as a result, he announces a freeze on Social Security benefits.
Wow, a complete freeze. That's a huge step.
It was. And it sparked immediate outrage across the country. People took to the streets in protest.
I bet the legal challenges started flying too.
Oh, yeah. This was seen as a drastic overreach of power, and people were furious.
And these protests weren't just about money. They were about a fundamental breach of trust.
Exactly. People felt betrayed by the government they relied on. Then, on February 26th, those protests escalated into something even bigger.
Mass demonstrations across the country.
Exactly. People were demanding accountability from Trump and Musk. They wanted answers about the data breaches, the missing payments, and the whole mess with Social Security.
They felt like their future had been stolen.
And their voices were getting louder.
So how did the administration respond to all this?
On February 27th, President Trump gave a speech on TV where he blamed the entire situation on what he called the deep state.
The deep state. That's a term we've heard a lot in recent years.
It's often used to describe this supposed shadowy network within the government that's working against the president.
So he's basically saying there's a conspiracy to sabotage him.
That was his argument. And it further divided the country. Some people believed him, while others saw it as a desperate attempt to deflect blame.
It's a classic tactic to point the finger at enemies, real or imagined, when things go wrong.
It often works to rally your base, but it also undermines trust in institutions and fuels further polarization.
Right. It creates this us versus them mentality that's very dangerous for democracy.
It makes it harder to have rational conversations and find common ground.
Okay, so we're at the end of February now, and things are already at a fever pitch. Then the administration turns its attention back to immigration.
On February 29th, they announced that they were revoking temporary protected status for over 500,000 immigrants.
500,000 people. That's a massive number. Remind us what TPS is all about.
It's a program that grants temporary legal status to people from countries facing extreme hardship, like war or natural disasters. It lets them live and work in the U.S. until it's safe to go back home.
So these are people who've been living in the U.S. legally, building lives here.
Many have been here for years. Revoking TPS puts them at risk of deportation, even if their home countries are still dangerous.
That's a huge disruption to their lives and their communities, and it's bound to face legal challenges.
Absolutely. It also raises humanitarian concerns. Many of these people have nowhere else to go.
Then, on March 1st, there's a particularly cruel move targeting some of the most vulnerable immigrants, unaccompanied children.
The administration cuts legal aid for those kids. We're talking about 26,000 children who are all alone, trying to navigate the complex immigration system.
These are kids who are often fleeing violence and poverty, right?
Many have experienced trauma, and now they have to face deportation proceedings without legal representation.
That's a blatant violation of basic fairness and due process.
It's incredibly difficult for adults to navigate the immigration system. Imagine what it's like for a child without legal help.
Then, on March 2nd, things take an even more disturbing turn.
Attorney General Pam Bondi starts targeting law firms that have been suing the administration.
So they're going after the lawyers who are trying to hold them accountable.
That's what it looks like. This is a direct attack on the legal profession and the right to legal representation.
It creates a climate of fear. If you're a lawyer, you have to worry about being targeted by the government for simply doing your job.
It also undermines the entire legal system. If lawyers can't freely represent their clients, the system breaks down.
Then, on March 3rd, there's a move to speed up deportations.
An executive order comes down aimed at expediting the removal of immigrants from the country.
So even less due process for those facing deportation.
That's the concern. The administration argued that it was necessary to address the backlog in the immigration courts.
But critics said it was really about rushing people through the system without giving them a fair chance to present their case.
It's a classic tension between efficiency and fairness.
Then, on March 4th, President Trump takes aim at the judges themselves,
He publicly criticizes judges who were involved in immigration cases.
accusing them of being biased against his policies.
That was the implication. And this kind of attack on the judiciary is incredibly dangerous.
It undermines the whole principle of an independent judiciary.
It also sets a bad precedent. If you don't like a court's ruling, you just attack the judge's character.
Then, on March 5th, the administration proposes something that would directly impact the immigration courts, reducing the number of judges.
The stated reason was efficiency, but critics saw it as a way to further cripple the already overwhelmed system.
Fewer judges means longer wait times and potentially less careful consideration of each case.
Exactly. It was a recipe for more injustice, not less.
Then, on March 6th, they expand those detention centers used to hold immigrants.
And they did it without getting approval from Congress, which raised questions about whether they were overstepping their authority.
Congress controls the purse strings, right? They're supposed to approve spending like that.
They are. So this move was seen as another example of executive overreach.
Okay, then on March 7th, there's an escalation of those ICE raids.
This time, they specifically targeted sanctuary cities, those places that have policies limiting cooperation with federal immigration enforcement.
So basically a direct challenge to those cities' authority.
It was, and it created a lot of fear in immigrant communities.
People were afraid to leave their homes, worried that they or their loved ones could be swept up in these raids.
It also reignited that whole debate about local versus federal power, especially when it comes to immigration.
Then, on March 8th, all those actions on immigration lead to another wave of lawsuits.
Civil rights groups like the ACLU filed class action lawsuits challenging the constitutionality and legality of these policies.
They were arguing that these policies were not only cruel, but also violated both U.S. and international law.
It was a major legal battle with huge implications for the rights of immigrants and the future of immigration policy in the U.S.
Okay, so it's been a whirlwind month with major changes on multiple fronts. Then, starting around March 11th, the focus shifts to the global stage and the economy, specifically the trade war with China.
President Trump announces new tariffs on Chinese goods.
Tariffs are those taxes on imported goods, right?
Exactly. And this move immediately escalated the trade tensions between the two countries.
I'm guessing the markets didn't react well.
They didn't. There was a lot of volatility and uncertainty. Businesses were worried about the impact on their supply chains and their profits.
And China wasn't just going to sit back and take it.
Nope. On March 12th, they retaliated with their own tariffs on U.S. products.
Things like agricultural goods and technology, right?
Those were the main targets, and it hit American businesses and consumers hard. It was a clear demonstration of how interconnected the global economy is.
You can't just mess with one part of the system without feeling the effects elsewhere.
Exactly.
Then, on March 13th, those trade tensions really start to rattle the markets.
The stock market takes a big dip. Investors are worried about the potential for a full-blown trade war and what it could mean for the economy.
A trade war benefits no one.
It rarely does. Then, on March 14th, American farmers start making their voices heard.
They're often the ones who feel the pain first in these situations, right?
Yeah. They are. They lose access to markets, their prices drop, and their livelihoods are threatened.
So they organize protests demanding that the government reconsider these policies.
They wanted to show the real human cost of this trade war.
Okay, then it looks like things get serious enough to warrant an international response.
On March 15th, the G20 nations call an emergency meeting.
The G20, that's the group of the world's biggest economies, right?
That's right. They're all worried about the potential for this trade war to spiral out of control and damage the global economy.
So it's not just about the U.S. and China anymore, it's a global problem.
Exactly.
Then, on March 16th, there's a surprising development from the administration. They say they might rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
The TPP. That's the trade agreement that Trump pulled out of in his first term.
What prompted this change of heart?
Growing concerns about China's growing influence in the Asia-Pacific region. They saw the TPP as a way to counter that influence?
So it's all about geopolitics.
To a large extent, yes. Then, on March 17th, Congress starts to push back against the president's trade powers.
They don't like being sidelined in these decisions.
They don't. Lawmakers from both parties introduce bills that would limit the president's ability to impose tariffs without congressional approval.
So they're trying to reassert their authority in this area.
They see it as a matter of checks and balances.
Okay, then, on March 18th, we see more of the real-world consequences of these policies, this time for small businesses.
They're struggling to cope with the rising cost of imported goods.
Those tariffs are hitting them hard.
They are. Some are forced to raise prices, which hurts their sales. Others are even going out of business.
It's a ripple effect throughout the economy.
And it's often the smallest businesses that are most vulnerable.
Then finally, on March 19th, we see signs that public support for these policies is starting to wane.
Opinion polls show that fewer people approve of the administration's approach to trade.
They're worried about the impact on the economy, their jobs, their wallets.
It's a sign that the political winds might be shifting.
Wow, what a ride. That was a lot to take in. But I think we managed to give everyone a good overview of a truly historic period.
It was definitely an eventful few weeks. We saw the administration take some bold and controversial actions, and we saw how those actions triggered reactions from all sides.
We had legal challenges, protests, international tensions, economic turmoil, and a whole lot of debate about the future of American democracy.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is. Decisions made in one area can have ripple effects across the entire system.
And it shows that the fight for power and control is never ending.
It's a constant struggle between different branches of government, between different interest groups, and between different visions for the future of the country.
So as you process all this, think about the bigger questions. What does this period tell us about the state of American democracy?
What are the limits of executive power? How do we balance security with liberty?
And how do we navigate the complexities of a globalized world?
These are the questions that will continue to shape our future.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, giving you the information and the context you need to engage those conversations and make informed decisions. Thanks for joining us.